thank you. And now I'm going to hand over to Rory. Rory Dimond is project assistant at Heath Hands, which is the voluntary organisation that Liz has already mentioned. He's previously worked for Bug Life and for Friends of the Earth. He's a passionate wildlife enthusiast, and he has a wealth of nature conservation experience and a particular interest in insects, pollinators, and other invertebrates. He supervises volunteer sessions and he helps coordinate wildlife interpretation and wildlife monitoring programs. He's passionate about inspiring others and appreciates the importance of communicating about nature conservation. So I'm going to hand over to you now. Rory, there you go. And you should be able to start your screen share now.
Oops.
Yep. So we can see your screen.
Okay, can you see our presentation?
Perfect. Yep, perfect.
Excellent.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. It's been very interesting sitting in on a Hampstead Heath survey meeting already, and nice to hear Heath Hands' name being bandied about as wildlife monitors on the Heath. So I think you've done part of my presentation for me already. Still, I'll elaborate more on some of the wildlife monitoring programs we have at the Heath, run by ourselves in partnership with the City of London and English Heritage, who manage the Heath, and yes, some of the special species that we have on the Heath that we survey too. So a bit insider knowledge. So I imagine most of you will know a lot about Hampstead Heath already. Just in the interests of introduction, Hampstead Heath, it's 275 hectare green space in North London, and it's got a rich variety of habitats, quite a mosaic of habitats, including some sandy heath, which the heath is named for, a lot less than there was originally, and it's a habitat that the City of London is aiming to restore. We also have the only 2 sphagnum bog sites in London, lots of other wetland areas, since Heath has 36 ponds, and I'll be talking to you about different ponds in a bit. And yes, acid grassland and wildflower meadows too. So it's a very lovely place. As well as all these lovely natural assets, these one alongside, having lots of visitors to the Heath, lots of dogs as well, I'm sure you well know. It's estimated to have 9.3 million visitors per annum, and that is certainly increased with lockdown, especially over the summer when it became everyone's pub garden and a place to go. And we do care a lot for wildlife on the Heath. The City of London Corporation, who manage most of the Heath, have dedicated conservation, ecology and tree teams to manage the Heath sensitively for wildlife. And as Heath Hands, we run volunteer programmes. We provide a lot of boots on the ground to help City of London English Heritage manage the Heath. And the backbone of what we do is conservation volunteering, for practical habitat management. But we also, as we mentioned, we offer wildlife interpretation sessions to engage people with nature on the Heath. And of course, as I'm about to talk to you about, we have our wildlife monitor volunteers, wonderful wildlife monitor volunteers, some of whom are in the audience. Here's the Heath. It's a very complex green space, as you can see. The area in red is the Kenwood Estate, which is managed by English Heritage, and that's our lovely office. We think it's the most beautiful office in London, in the Dairy Building. And you can see it's quite complex habitats, woodland, lots of open areas. Just draw your attention to 2 main pond chains on the Heath, which I'll be talking to you about, context of some of our wildlife. So we have the Highgate Pond chain on the eastern edge, and sort of in the middle and down at the southern point of the Heath, we have the Hampstead Pond chain, which you come to if you enter the Heath from Hampstead Heath Station. It's both fed by the Fleet Stream as well, so the Heath, on the Heath you can see the Fleet Stream before it goes underground in the city. As I'm sure you well know now, especially after Liz's talk, Heath is a very biodiverse place. I won't insult you by reading through this slide, but yeah, we've got many species that we're proud to have on the Heath, both flora and fauna and fungi, etc. So on to our volunteer monitoring. The way we run this is it's essentially volunteer-led. As us as staff, we do a bit of string pulling, we do coordination, and we also work very closely with the City of London ecologist to ensure that the surveys we're doing are relevant and useful to what the Heath's aims and objectives are. And so this, we run ID and survey training workshops for our volunteers. These are open to all Heath Hands volunteers and sometimes public as well. Sometimes with external experts, often in-house too. We do the recruitment and induction of volunteers, and they get a monitor pack which gives them the context of some of the wildlife on the heath, some of the species that we survey, and it's about how we run the surveys. And some of our more experienced volunteers who've been with us for a few years, they are appointed as transect leaders, and they can lead the new volunteers when they're going out surveying, which system works really well. We tend to do weekly surveys of all the wildlife we survey, and weather permitting, of course. The way we record things is volunteers record things as they go out, however they like to volunteer, however they like to record them, whether it be on paper or smartphones, etc. And then Heath Hands on our cloud database on our computers, we hold the master spreadsheets. So we add to them based on the information coming in from volunteers. I won't lay that too much, but it's something that's quite important because paper records are very easily lost, even with the best will in the world. And so it's often me who gets to do all the boring spreadsheet stuff of it. We also have a roundup meeting where we discuss how things went, a bit similar to what Liz has done for your group, and talk about some interesting findings, maybe ways we can improve for next year for various different surveys. And all this gets fed back to City of London ecologist, and the information is then used to inform the Heath's annual work programme for managing the habitats on the Heath. And these are also more widely shared by the Green Space Information and Greater London Authority, or GIGL, as we know it. So on to our first special species on the Heath, which some people are quite alarmed to discover we have. Is our grass snakes. I think they're wonderful. They're a largest British snake, but they're non-venomous, so not dangerous at all. They are, in fact, probably likely very nervous of people. We tend to find them in more private areas. We get a few public sightings a year, but mostly they go unseen. They are semi-aquatic. They mostly hunt amphibians. They do also feed on fish, rodents, sometimes nestling birds. And so they do enjoy the Heath with its many wetland areas, and they can occasionally be seen swimming in the ladies' swimming ponds as well. They're the only native reptile that we currently have on the Heath, but a bit more on that later. And yes, so most found in private areas. So grass snakes nationally, they're a Biodiversity Action Plan priority species, which means they've undergone substantial decline. On the Heath, they did decline quite considerably to presumed extinction as grazing ceased on the Heath. So the Heath was once common land, which was grazed with sheep and cattle, and that kept it very open. It kept it heathy and with lots of grassland areas, which the snakes prefer because it's sunnier. And as the Heath has become more forested, we think that that's the habitat change that made them cause the grass snakes to decline and be lost. So yes, it's an interesting history to the Hampstead Heath population because they derive from a very successful reintroduction. Grass snake surveys are the first surveys that we launched as Heath Hands in 2011, and still one of our most successful. So the way we survey for grass snakes, I'm sure some of you have done reptile surveys already, but we use a fairly standard method where we put out sheets of corrugated onduline roofing felt. So they're dark coloured, they warm up in the sun, and the snakes go under them because they're ectothermic. The snakes go under the mats to bask, and we lay these out on set routes around the heath, which are called transects. We have 3 transects on the heath, survey them weekly. So essentially, we go around and flip up the mats, see how many snakes we find, roughly note what sort of size they are, which gives us a judgment of the snake's age. And we do note other species found on the mats as well, because we do get amphibians and small mammals. We do this from April to November. Previously did it up till October, but they are active quite late in the year. I saw one under a mat a couple of weeks ago. And yes, for the purposes of standardization and comparison, we geolocate all the maps so we know which locations they are, so we can lay them out in similar locations each year. Just a bit more detail about the history of the snake surveys. So they were introduced in 1985 by Tom Langton, who I'm sure some of you will know is quite a big name in the reptile world, UK reptile world. He introduced 50 individuals to an area called the Bird Sanctuary. In 2008-2009, spring and summer, London, Essex and Hertfordshire Amphibian and Reptile Trust did a Heath-wide survey, and they found 58, well, they made 58 records of the grass snakes. In 2010, the City of London attempted to set up staff monitoring, so they trained up their staff to survey the snakes as we do, but due to very limited capacity, they got very limited records. And in 2011, we launched our reptile survey project along with Heath ecologist, and upped the number of records considerably, which is good news. So from then till now, we've had 1,022 records of grass snakes, that's sightings of grass snakes. This gives you an idea of the sort of habitat we find the grass snakes in private areas on the heath, so you can see they're a bit wilder than much of the public areas. So some findings we've had from the surveys, lots of good things. So we still have snakes, which is excellent. And we're finding a mix of age ranges, so we know they are breeding. And generally on one of the transects around the Highgate Pond, so that's on the eastern pond chain on the heath, snake numbers appear to be stable, which is good. And they have dispersed across the heath from their reintroduction sites. So overall, yes, very successful monitoring project with snakes. Of course, not everything's rosy with wildlife. Have found that snakes may be subject to, maybe quite sensitive rather to disturbance, since we do put some mats out in public areas, but we don't tend to find them there. It's people, maybe it's dogs, maybe it's predators, we don't know. On the Kenwood estate, we tried to survey them, but there's so few of them that we eventually abandoned the transect because it wasn't very rewarding for volunteers. We're still not certain exactly where the snakes breed, a bit more on that in a moment, but we do provide nesting habitats for the grass snakes in the form of grass piles and cuttings on the heath. So grass snakes, they like to lay their eggs in decaying vegetation because that keeps them warm, helps to incubate the eggs and hatch out. But we've yet to see the smoking gun of hatchling snakes coming out of a compost heap, or hatching size snakes and being on a compost heap as yet. And even though they seem to be doing okay around the Highgate ponds, there's a noticeable decline in one area of the heath on the northeast, which I'll elaborate on here. So this is just a chart of the way, well, what we use as a proxy for the population of snakes is we look at the average number that we find in a given year. So that's the number of snake sightings divided by the number of survey outings, number of transect visits. We do this because you can recognize individual grass snakes by their belly patterns, but we avoid doing this, at least at the moment, because we think this might be just a bit too much disturbance for the snakes since they're already in the private areas, and we don't want to stress them out too much. We're generally happy so long as we know that there's a mixed age range of them and that we're getting fairly steady numbers, or even better would be to get higher numbers 3 years. But as you can see, this is transect 1, which is on the northeast side of the heath. You can see a marked decline in records in 2017. That's when some building work started next door to one of the, it's off the heath, on neighbours on the heath, that's building work started next door to one of the enclosures. And so they were scarified. You had vehicles going around, which of course caused a lot of disturbance to the snakes. They were a bit worried that because it was an area that's left derelict and left to go wild, it might have been a breeding site. But again, we don't know, it was off the heath. And since then, it's been much poorer detection on this transect than it was before. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and hoping those numbers go back up. And some good news, or potential good news, is that it seems that the juvenile snakes, based on the number of juvenile records we've got, it seems they might have dispersed to other areas rather than completely disappeared. But again, it's something that we really need individual recognition to clinch. It's a bit about how we recognise the age ranges of the snakes. So there is published guidance on how to age grass snakes based on their size range. And we find hatchling size snakes up to a record breaker on the heath is 150 centimetres. So they do get quite large. And so we hope they are breeding on the heath. So on to something a bit more cuddly. Hedgehogs on Hampstead Heath. As Liz mentioned, we're very fortunate that Hampstead Heath appears to have the largest population of hedgehogs in London. And we know this from many previous surveys. So there's a few ways you can survey for hedgehogs. Camera trapping is probably the most effective method. It's where you put out wildlife cameras. You might see these trail cameras of various nature documentaries where you strap them to a tree, turn them on, they either detect movement or body heat, movement or body heat. And then you can see video evidence or photo evidence of hedgehogs using the area. That's mostly what we do. We've also used footprint tunnels, which I'll elaborate on in a bit. But basically, you see where hedgehogs are walking around by setting out tunnels and with eco-friendly ink and seeing if there's any little hedgehog footprints. And torchlight surveys as well. So that's literally just going out at night and shining torches around, searching for hedgehogs. And a nice picture of one which is in the red light, which is more sensitive to hedgehog eyes. So the first Heath-wide survey for hedgehogs in 2016 by City of London staff and Heath Hands volunteers. We found about 20 hedgehogs then, or 20 records of hedgehogs. And since then, we've had 2 really big survey efforts led by London Hog Watch, so in partnership with ZSL and with LNHS, working with LNHS as well in 2017. So put camera traps all around the heath essentially. 2021 survey this year, we put out 150 camera traps across the heath. So we're really into finding out exactly where the hedgehogs are and what the relative numbers might be in different areas. And we found that hedgehogs are present across the heath, right from the south to the northern areas. So it's like they're using gardens around the heath too. And they seem to, we particularly detect them in areas that are more manicured, funnily enough. You think of hedgehogs as preferring wilder areas, but they seem to like going out on cut lawns to forage for worms, coming out their hiding places at night. So find them around the cricket pitch, Parliament Hill, Golders Hill Park is a particularly good place for them. Recently we've been making hedgehog boxes for some of our volunteers and putting them out across the heath for another planned way to survey them. And yeah, just a few weeks ago, we got some hedgehog first aid training from ZSL, which we're very grateful for, so that we know how to support sick or injured hedgehogs if we find them and who to pass them on to as well. Unfortunately, it's not an infrequent occurrence on the heath to find sick or injured hedgehogs. So yes, I've elaborated some of the survey methods. Here's a footprint tunnel. So what you do is you set up these tunnels, and you have 2 bits of A4 paper stuck onto a board inside them. You smear a bit of biological ink on there. It's basically charcoal mixed with vegetable oil on both the bits of paper, just on the inside of the tunnel. So no matter which direction the hedgehog goes, it leaves some footprints. And you bait it with some nice tasty cat food. Another step is to peg it down, otherwise the foxes like to have their way with it, and dogs as well. And the setup's being very nicely demonstrated by your chair there. And this is what we get out of them, nice little hoggy footprints, which are very sweet and very nice to see. So with camera trapping, this is direct from the London Hogwatch report from 2018. So the red circles show where hedgehogs are detected, bigger circles show there are more hedgehogs. So you can see they're quite widely distributed across the heath. And here's one of our youth volunteers setting up on the cameras in the last survey. And you get some excellent photos of hedgehogs on these. I particularly like the evil potato in the bottom left. And the glowing hedgehog is one that's detected by infrared, so sort of night vision, body heat. But yes, they show you that hedgehogs are present, and they're nice things to be able to show people. As well as hedgehogs, get incidental records of other mammals, so it's quite interesting to see where we detect muntjac deer, because they are nocturnal. You don't very rarely see them during the day. I've never actually seen one on the heath, and people are very surprised that we have them. Also rabbits, we mentioned earlier, they seem to be, from the survey, seem to be largely restricted to Kenwood Estate now. You can see them around there in the evenings, but they've definitely substantially declined on the heath. And the most exciting thing in the bottom left was one badger from the 2017 survey. Badgers had previously lived on the heath, but this one we reckon is a transient individual that's just passing through from nearby area, but it's still quite a nice species tick for the heath there. So on to some smaller things, insects, which are my first love. So we also run dragonfly surveys on the heath, as Liz mentioned. We've had 17 species of dragonfly and damselfly or data recorded on the heath. That includes beautiful damoiselle, which probably doesn't breed on the heath but has been seen. And so the idea behind the dragonfly surveys is to assess the ecological conditions of the the heath's ponds. And so, as some of you might know, if you live locally or follow the history of the heath for a while, there was a big, what's called the Ponds Project on the heath, which basically the major pond chains were drained, dredged and restructured for flood alleviation works for the local area. There was a lot of local opposition to this, and of course it was taking out a lot of habitats, valuable wetland habitat. So part of the condition of the Ponds Project was doing some ecological mitigation and actually improving the ponds for wildlife as a result of it, the end result. I'll elaborate more about that in a second. So essentially you want to know how dragonflies are faring in the ponds that have now been refilled and restructured. And volunteers, they follow, wildlife and volunteers follow a method from the British Dragonfly Society, which is essentially either walking a transect or stopping at various sighting points on the heath's ponds and noting down the species you see and an abundance estimate. So rather than trying to count the dragonflies and damselflies, which can be nigh impossible, because A, they're very fast, and B, damselflies, when they're mating, they mate en masse. So you have various abundance categories to class them into. And so for one of the ponds in particular, which we call the model boating ponds, which is on the Highgate chain, it's a pond where previously, prior to the pond works, it was used as a model boating pond by the Victorians, and it's very steep-sided. There's no vegetation around the edges of the pond, no shoreline vegetation at all, pretty much. And previous surveys by dragonfly specialists, they said this pond isn't worth bothering surveying because there's so few dragonflies, so probably not breeding in there. Since that, it's become one of the best ponds for dragonflies and damselflies, which is a good positive from introducing lots of vegetation around the edges. We have reed beds there, and we have lots of marginal flowering vegetation too, which is certainly boosting the breeding habitat for dragonflies there and the hunting habitat as well. And yes, so volunteers recorded the first willow emerald damselfly to be seen on the heath in 2018. And since that first one, they've spread all across the heath. It was very exciting at first, and now they appear to be becoming common as muck across London, but there's still a really beautiful species. It's a species that's fairly new to the UK and has moved north with climate change. And it's a damselfly, larger than other damselflies, lovely metallic green. This is one in the bottom corner here. And they lay their eggs in willow stems above the water, and then the nymphs hatch into the water. So a lovely species to see. They can be quite late as well. I saw a couple in October this year. So hopefully this table means something to some people. It just gives you a general impression of the distribution of dragonfly and damselfly species around the ponds. The two most common dragonflies, or most widespread dragonflies in terms of where the ponds that we find them on, are migrant hawkers and brown hawkers, which are both quite large, quite impressive dragonflies. And the commonest in terms of numbers are certainly the red-eyed and azure damselflies, which gather in huge numbers on the ponds. So on to another insect group, butterflies. We have 29 species of butterflies recorded on the heath, which is a very good site for London. There's lots of habitat features on the heath which favour them, lots of tall grassland, which suits lots of the grass and butterfly species that breed on grasses. Lots of brambly edges, which are really good for nectar provision when they're in flower, and hedgerows as well. So lots of different habitat structures that butterflies favour. And have a few woodland species, a lot of grassland species, lots of species you associate with parks and gardens too. So we record butterflies using the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme methods, which is run by Butterfly Conservation. And the Heath already has a long-running survey, one of these UK BMS surveys, which has been going since 1977. So it's a long time series of records. But fortunately, in that time, the habitats have changed a bit. They've scrubbed over, they've become less favourable to the grassland and meadow butterfly species. In collaboration with a Heath ecologist and ourselves, and particularly Joe in the audience, we set up a trial transect in 2020 around the Parliament Hill area. And the reason for that's linked to the ponds project as well. So as well as improving the aquatic habitat directly around the ponds, also with some of the landscape changing around them, areas were seeded wildflower meadow seed mix, and they're now managed as wildflower meadow areas. So these obviously have huge benefit to butterflies and other pollinators. So we were really keen to, or the ecologist especially was really keen to establish how much butterflies are benefiting from these. Yes, and since it is a UK BMS survey, even though it's a trial one, records will feed into the UK and to butterfly conservation. It proved successful. We're running a couple of years, but of course 2021 wasn't the best year for surveying, but we managed. But hopefully we'll have some more thorough UK BMS surveys that we can then pass on to butterfly conservation. And these starts to inform the Heath's annual work plan. So I mentioned different habitats, so how we manage the meadows. Different areas of grassland on the Heath have different mowing regimes. So it's good to know where good places for breeding grassland butterflies are. Areas that we allow what you might think of as pernicious weeds like thistles, ragwort. They're both really good plants for butterfly. Thistles are used by this was used by painted ladies to breed on, especially, and nettles as well, excellent for lots of our butterfly species like small tortoise shells at the top there, and peacocks. So it all informs how the Heath's conservation ecology team manage the habitats on the Heath to balance the leisure with the wildlife on the Heath. And yes, a very nice, very, very nice recording on the Heath that's made by Liz of the first white admiral recorded on the Heath in 30 years. And that was, strictly speaking, it wasn't actually on the butterfly survey, it was recorded on the dragonfly survey, but it does show you the value of having more boots on the ground, more people looking out for wildlife. And you notice these things. That's very nice. Thank you for the photo, Liz. So this gives you an impression. This is the transect route. So you can see the transect, it goes through various different habitats on the Heath, and it's planned that way. So it has sections which go through grassland, sections through woodland, wildflower meadows around area 6 especially, and it takes in some of the riparian edges of the lakes as well, where we've got the ponds as well, where we've got lots of flowering vegetation in there. Elaborate a bit more on the UK BMS method for those who might not know. So this transect's walked repeatedly through the year, preferably weekly, weather dependent, and you count the butterflies that's seen within 5 meters of the survey area, just because that's deemed the distance you can see butterflies and still identify them from. And you try and count them going in ones that go one direction, so not double counting, but it doesn't matter so much, because you do notice differences in abundance if you're doing regular surveys. So I thought you'd like to see some of the butterfly species that we record on the Heath. So these are all species that recorded on our transects, a new one. Yes, a very nice spectacular array of butterflies. Small coppers down the bottom, we don't tend to find a lot of them. Certainly the most abundant ones are meadow browns, which you get thousands and thousands of, which is brilliant because it shows that the grasslands are being managed well for them to breed in. Ringlets very well too. Small heath, it's nice to have on the Heath. Small heath on Hampstead Heath, very nice to have too. And see, for those who are not so familiar with butterflies, so the second row from the bottom, these species are largely, so it's painted lady, that's dependent on nettles, stinging nettles as food plants, and they generally do very well on the Heath. We've noticed pretty good numbers of small tortoiseshell, which is encouraging, as that's a species that's declined of late. Common blues as well, they are a fairly common species of grassland butterfly, but they're nice to note, especially in the meadow areas, because part of the sea mix of the meadow areas is bursfoot trefoil, and that's one of the major caterpillar food plants for common blues. And we noticed huge numbers of common blues there, especially as compared to the older survey, the older transect. So it shows the worth of looking at these different habitats, different areas of the Heath for monitoring butterflies. Onto less desirable species of Lepidoptera on the Heath. So most of the wildlife surveys we do are quite positive. They're about species we want to celebrate. And this one is an invasive, which we would rather not have, but unfortunately we do. So the Proccessionary moth, if you've been on Heath, you might have seen signs about it, about health and safety issues associated with it. So it's a species of moth which has arrived from the continents and southern Europe mainly. The main issue with it is a public health issue, that the caterpillars are covered in irritating hairs. They shed these quite regularly. They make nests, communal nests out of the hairs when they're getting ready to pupate. And these are really harmful if you end up breathing them in. They can cause rashes on your skin, especially bad issue for the tree team, because of course they're up in the trees working. So they feed on oak trees. They don't actually seem to be a big issue for the trees themselves, so they can survive defoliation. and caterpillars rarely completely defoliate the trees, but they're still an undesirable species to have on the heath. So when they first arrived in the UK, they arrived on consignments of trees from the continent for planting schemes. Unfortunately, they first arrived on Heath in 2015, and at that time the goal was eradicate them completely from the heath, but that's now become impossible because they must, once, if they go undetected and they reach adulthood, then the moths can disperse and fly around and come in from people's gardens. So they're essentially out of control on the heath now, but we can target management to take them out of areas where there are high public risk. So it's essentially where you've got isolated trees in nice open areas that people congregate around, or trees around playgrounds, on well-used paths on the heath. So our involvement in the story of late Proccessionary moth on the heath is that the tree team invited us to do a trial survey on Hampstead Heath extension in 2019. It's the most northerly part of the heath, and that's where the caterpillars were first recorded. And that proved very successful. Volunteers found volunteers found quite a lot of nests. They're very difficult to spot, so you do need training to get your eye in, and they're often in the tree canopy. And so we rolled this out in Highgate Wood after the successes in the heath extension, and 83 affected trees were found there. So it's a good way of identifying where the nests are and where to target removal. And so this helps us identify trends in populations as well and target treatment. So let's talk a bit about treatment. The heath team, we don't want to use general insecticides because, of course, they're terrible for lots of species of insect. They're not targeted, so they'd eradicate pretty much everything on the oak trees that you spray them with, which we do not want because we're all about conservation. So we use a target. So the tree team and the contractors they employ to come in, they use a bacterial insecticide, which is a Bacillus thuringiensis, which only targets butterfly and moth caterpillars. So it's not species specific, but it's as specific as we can get. And we use the results on butterfly monitoring as well as moth trapping surveys of native species to identify areas where we certainly don't want to spray with these caterpillar killing bacteria. But if you've been walking around the heath and seeing big vehicles spraying stuff into the trees, rest assured it's not something that affects humans, and it is very targeted. It's not killing off lots of non-target species. So those are the main wildlife monitoring programs that we have currently on the heath. So our next steps now, we've always got a lot to consider with our volunteer programs. So of course we're going to continue with the volunteer monitoring because it's been very successful. Our volunteers really enjoy doing it, and we really enjoy running it, and it's a great asset to the City of London as well, having more people on the ground surveying the wildlife, so they know the fortunes of some of the heath special species and how to target the conservation. So in coming years we'll be involving our youth volunteers. So we have a youth volunteer program at Heath Hands, and it's with teenagers, so a couple of cohorts of teenagers, and they are very good volunteers, and we've had them doing various odd jobs on the heath. They have made lots of hedgehog boxes and bat boxes, other animal homes, and so we're looking to increase their involvement with some of the wildlife surveying, which we're sure they'll enjoy, and hopefully having a journey for them from making a hedgehog box to putting it out and then monitoring them, and surveying some of the other wildlife as well. We're always about raising the profile of the heath wildlife. So we have a public engagement programme called Wild About Hampstead Heath, which ceased during lockdown, basically the way this ran was that we have these trikes which can fold out, set up as stalls on the heath, and you can have nature-based activities, be that pond dipping as here, bird watching, nature crafts, all things to engage the public with nature. We're looking to relaunch it with the big garden bird watch in January, and so yeah, we're looking forward to welcoming those volunteers back. And yeah, we found that's really great. Families especially really enjoy it, and lots of people who have a passing interest in wildlife or don't necessarily notice so much of wildlife. Some people don't even notice parakeets on the heath, believe it or not. Yeah, lots of people have told us that it's brilliant being able to talk to expert volunteers and learn about different species we have on the heath and how they can look out for them. It's very nice. Same acronym, we've also just launched a Wildlife Around Hampstead Heath project, which is the project I'm most involved in. Well, we just started it in October, but we'll be running that for the next couple of years, and that's got various veins to it, Heritage Lottery funded, and what we're going to be doing is engaging with people on the heath, engaging with local community groups and schools, and talk to them about wildlife on the heath, but also how to manage their own green spaces better for wildlife, and how to connect up areas for some of the wildlife that we find on the heath, and hopefully a recording project as well that might be similar to LNHS Garden Mammals project, something similar to that. And so it's about the community outreach and hopefully benefiting wildlife at the same time. And we'd also like to set up some citizen science projects, a bit as part of Wildlife Around Hampstead Heath, but we're also open to getting involved in more national survey schemes on the heath. And yeah, that might be something that you could advise us on, which would be excellent. And encourage local communities to support wildlife, as I said. And so yes, we say encourage local communities. So we have a project in draft which we called Gospel's Hedgehogs project for now. So it's mainly going to be focusing on house sparrows and hedgehogs. So now there are populations of house sparrows around Savernake Road and various areas bordering the heath. We're trying to encourage them onto the heath too, to be protected, but we'd like to engage local communities to ensure that those house sparrow colonies are protected, because as many of you will know, they're and provided for in people's gardens. Many of you know they've declined quite considerably, actually. And yes, so installing hedgehog boxes around the heath, and also back boxes, more compost piles for the grass snakes to breed in, and even some loggeries for stag beetles, so part buried log structures. And we'll be working with our volunteers to install more of those, and hopefully local community groups too. So I'm duty bound, since we are a charity, to mention some of the ways that you can help us. So there's shameless self-promotion. You can adopt one of our wildlife homes that I mentioned. Grass snakes are quite popular actually, which is very good to see. Of course, you can join us as a volunteer, and we're especially interested in having new wildlife monitors on board. Yes, so if you're interested in some of the survey schemes that we're doing, you'd like to be involved, we'd love to hear from you. They finished for this year, but we'll be relaunching April next year. So love for you to engage with us, and various ways you can donate to us as well to help us with our work. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you've learned a lot more about what Heath Hands does, survey wildlife on the heath, hopefully learned a bit more about species that we have on the heath too. And yeah, it's lovely to talk to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory. That was really excellent and inspiring account of all the activity that Heath Hands are carrying out, and you really covering a wide range of species. I particularly was taken with the footprint tunnels, I have to say. And
yeah, they're very sweet. Yeah, they're like tiny handprints.
Yeah, they are really cute. And I was interested in the damselfly and dragonfly survey, and one thing just maybe to ask about is why are some of the ponds seem to be so much better for dragonflies and damselflies and some of the others. And are there any plans to kind of maybe work on improving some of the ponds which don't seem to be working so well?
I think part of it is largely down to size. The larger ponds, just because they've got more habitat area and we've got more edge habitat in them. But actually there's a pond called Makes Pond, which is on the side of Parliament Hill, just up from Old Baiting Pond. And even though that's small and shallow, it is pretty good for some of the dragonfly species, especially black-tailed skimmer, and like shallow muddy pools. I'm not sure why they're missing from some of the ponds, but it can be just general survey effort as well, because they do tend to prioritise the larger ponds, which have had more work done to them and more interesting to the ecologists to find out what's going on in them. But it's the Dragonfly and Damselfly survey is definitely something we could build on and get in a better system for monitoring different ponds in different areas year on year.
Yeah, that will certainly be interesting as a kind of longer term project.
Yeah.
And really nice about the willow emeralds. They are, I mean, I know they're kind of around and about in quite a lot of places now, but really, they are really beautiful.
Yeah, they're lovely to see. Actually, on some of Dragonfly and Damselflies, Liz, I'm sure Liz will tell you, the Kenwood ponds are really good for them, but because they're not City of London land, we don't have an agreement to survey them with English Heritage, but that's something that we'll be working on for next year too. Getting more involved with surveying on English Heritage land. Yeah,
definitely. I'm sure that will be of great interest. So we've actually got quite a few questions coming through on the chat. So David or Anchor, are you able to pick those up?
Yeah, I can do. Goes one or two. We'll start with JK's question, which was around caterpillars and hornets. Have you seen any evidence of hornet predation on caterpillars?
Interesting one. Don't know about hornets, but there has been increased predation on caterpillars by great tits, which seem to have learned what the nests look like and what they contain, which is interesting. And there's one, I think I mentioned it in writing in the presentation, we talked about flies earlier, and there's a species of parasitic fly, the tachinid fly called Carcilia iliaca, I'll pronounce that wrong, but it's species specific to the oak processionary moth, and it's come over with them, and they seem to be in pretty good numbers on the heath now, and the Heath tree team reckon that they are quite an important biocontrol agent now, or potentially important biocontrol agent on the heath. I should mention Jeff, who's done some studies himself, where he's put some oak processionary moth nests in emergence cages, so they're out on the heath, but the moths and flies can't get out, and loads and loads of flies come out of the oak processionary moth nest. So that's some good news that got species specific parasites come over too.
Excellent, that's good news. There's one behind me on my video, by the way. That's an example of that fly. Not from the heath in that case, but there we go. So Liz asked about whether the bacillus that you're using to control the oak processionary moths also have an impact on the caterpillars of purple hair streak, which are an oak dwelling species.
Yes, it would do, which is one of the reasons we'd like more information where the purple hair streaks are, but it seems that purple hair streaks are pretty much on all the oaks around the heath, so it's more about targeted management to where it's more of a public safety risk. So if the I hate to say it, but if the purple hair streaks are widespread across the heath, then targeting particular trees hopefully won't have too much of an impact on their heath population.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to say that I'm not an expert in the actual treatment. That's all down to the City of London.
Can I just bring Liz in, David, before we go on to the next chat question?
Yeah, what I was going to say is it's probably pretty much the same as Rory, because last summer, for want of something better to do, I went out on warm sunny evenings and surveyed all oak trees I could find on edges, really, where there was a purple hairstreak colony. And I would say that they seem to be incredibly common. They're one of the commonest butterflies on the heath, probably, but we don't see them because they're all up in the canopy, and they tend to flit about in the evenings. But it may be that when the spraying is done for the bacillus, it's actually earlier in the year than when the her purple hairstreak caterpillars hatch. I don't know. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, because I think I did see purple hairstreak butterflies in some of the oaks that possibly had been sprayed earlier in the year.
Yeah, I'm not really an expert when it comes to the treatment of the trees, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see what there was. Well, one comment, one related question. So okay. M, who goes by a single letter, like the leader of some sort of spy agency. M commented it's a bit of a shame that you don't have a need. What was it? That you don't have a need for survey volunteers during the winter. And I guess implicitly, are there any winter surveys you could think of? And Rachel asked when you'll next be recruiting wildlife volunteers and survey volunteers.
So we start off in April, but if you want to register your interest whenever, we're happy to receive applications. So it's on the Heath Hands website. There is an application form, but it's very simple. You just tick what strand of volunteering you'd like to be part of, and give us a little bit of info about why you'd like to volunteer with us. And yeah, as I said, we are certainly after more wildlife monitoring volunteers. If you want to join as conservation volunteer, you can as well, but there's a bit of a waiting list, I'm afraid, because we've been sessions have been capped due to COVID.
So, and what we'll do is when the obviously we can put the link, the details, your website and the link.
That'll be wonderful, yeah,
in there. We'll put them in the chat, but also when we send out the email about the recording, I'll include them in there as well. Excellent, so yeah. So do have a look at the Heath Hands website. It's really, I found it really interesting, and obviously and it's good that you're people are interested and would like to kind of just
we need to elaborate. It's one of my jobs on hold is to elaborate on our wildlife monitoring pages on the website too. So there'll be more coming up on that soon. Sorry, on a comment about winter surveys, we do sometimes involve wildlife monitors in specific things, but it's generally down to capacity, because things get a lot busier with a conservation. Generally busier with the conservation volunteers in autumn and winter. It's outside nesting bird season, so you get the license to do lots more work. And it is nice to have a discrete time when you say we'll have a wrap-up meeting in autumn or winter and discuss next steps ahead. But we don't generally have need for lots of people. I mean, it's just because of the nature of the species we survey, it's reptiles and invertebrates.
Yeah. Have we got anything else in the chat, David? We've got about a minute or two to go.
There were two more from people who are from our committee. Liz asked whether you could help out with getting a fly survey for the Hampstead Heath survey. So
I thought it was going to be asked to do the bee survey.
Well, that as well. Anything you want.
We did consider having a bumblebee conservation run a bee walk scheme, and it's something I'd wanted to do, and then COVID hit and everything became a lot more complicated. So it's not something that we launched, but if things smooth out with the current programs we've got going, I would really like to do that. If anyone wants to express some interest in that, so it might help me petition my boss.
Excellent. I see you mentioned bees and Tony's hand has been raised.
Yeah.
Are you surprised? No, that'd be great. I mean, as I said before, it'd be really great if we can sort of combine fly and bee surveys, because that's so dependent on temperature for bees. Often we end up looking at flies when it's cold or damp, which is really useful. my problem is I don't have the time to do a regular transect on the site. So getting other people involved. The regular transects, and the transect idea is a brilliant idea, and it's a great thing to do. And it'd be fantastic to do that for the bees on the site. And the other thing that'd be really interesting is actually mapping where the bee aggregates are, where the nest aggregates are, because they can be quite dynamic. And we know that we're, particularly with the last season we've had, we're looking at potential population crashes all over the place from the spring. Oh, so it'd be interesting to see what happens next year. And then also looking at the associated kleptoparasites and flies that go with them. So there's lots to do. And the Heath is such a fantastic environment for that. But it's a huge site.
There's some huge aggregations of ashy mining bees and tawny mining bees, and
the funny thing is, you may not, I hadn't really appreciated it so much, but you may not know that the ashy mining bee used to be more of a northern bee, and it's only in recent years that it's suddenly recolonized or appeared from the continent and been moving from south to north again. So these big aggregates that we're seeing are actually relatively new. So it's quite an exciting time to be interested in bees, everybody.
Lots of ivy bees on the Heath too.
Absolutely. And again, what's really worth recording those, because they're big spread, but they're going through a boom and slump site. And the other thing to look out for are some of their kleptoparasites, Epiolus, which are beginning to appear all over the place, and transfer from other colony species. So there's lots of exciting work to be done there, if anybody's interested.
We're going to have to wrap things up now, but I can see there's a lot of potential for lots more for the Heath Hands to do, and there's no shortage of there's ideas coming through on the chat as well for Winterbird service. So please
see what capacity we have. Can I just say one thing I didn't verbally say, which I really should? It's so we've got some in the audience today, and thank you so much to all our volunteers who do this wildlife monitoring. They're the people on the ground most of the time. I just do not puppeteering so much, but the background stuff. And we certainly could not, in the most literal sense, we could not do this without them. So thank you all so much for your time and your efforts. So
that's really nice, and thank you as well for making. Obviously, doing the coordination is really important part of things. Don't happen without somebody kind of coordinating, and for all your enthusiasm and for all the public engagement work that's going on. And I like the involvement of the youth volunteers. I think that sounds really exciting. We've got lots of nice comments coming through about how what a lovely talk, how interesting that people have found it. So hopefully people will get
I'm glad.
Stay in touch. So thank you very much, Rory. That was really fantastic contribution to our series of talks, and it was a lovely way to move from the AGM to where Liz introduced some of the work to getting a really good picture about exactly what's happening on the Heath.